So, okay, let's start then. And I would like to start, hello, by thanking all the stakeholders and whom have provided either funding or collaborations in support for the work that we are to present here today, although we also present work from other people. And now I will give the word and screen to Ida-Maja for a bit of a background. Please, Ida-Maja.
Thank you, Ingela, and hello to everyone. Nice to be here today. So shipping is really the backbone of international trade, and some 90% of all goods are at some point transported by ships. And therefore, the shipping volumes over time also follow the economic development rather well. And since the 1970s, global trade have increased at least fourfold. Historically, shipping has been considered an environmentally friendly mode of transport. Next, please. But since the early 20th century, the sailing ships were replaced by motorized vessels. And in the 1960s, the development within the shipping industry allowed for burning of the residual products of from the oil refineries. And over time, the shipping industry became the major market for these cheap, so-called heavy fuel oils. And these heavy fuel oils rather reminds of bitumen, and they are even solid at room temperatures. You need to heat them before you can burn them in the ship engine. And with the increasing use of heavy fuel oil, there was also an increasing number of accidental oil spills. And this photo is from the island Tjörn on the Swedish west coast that was hit by oil in 2011. And the ambition to prevent oil pollution has also been a very important driver within the International Maritime Organization's early work to phase out substandard ships. Next, please. But in addition to accidents, there are also a range of environmental pressures from shipping originating from normal operation. And most of these subsystems that are listed here below the arrows, for example, ballast water or sewage, are to some extent regulated. But keep this in mind that every system is regulated separately, and you can see the corresponding, it's very small text, but just to indicate that there are separate regulations for all the onboard systems. Next, please. But if we instead take a look at the type of stressors related to each of the subsystems, we can see that many subsystems give rise to the same type of stressors. For example, invasive species can be spread both from biofouling on the ship hull and from ballast water, etc. And from an environmental or environmental management point of view, it is therefore essential to assess what is coming out from all the different subsystems on board all ships operating in a geographic area. So this was just to put a little bit wider context about what type of environmental impacts there are from shipping today. But I should mention that the arrows here are not proportional to the amount of contaminants coming out from the different subsystems. And in case they were proportional, the arrows from the atmospheric deposition, that is from the exhaust down to the sea surface, and also the scrubber water would be much, much bolder. And this is one reason why we believe that the topic of today is highly relevant, as ships' fuels represent a significant source of marine pollution, and the development today may actually imply increased risk in spite of bold global moves to reduce pollution from ship exhaust. So how did we end up here? Next, please. In the late 1990s, following gradually stricter emission standards for the land-based industries, it became clear that international shipping contributed to air pollution on local, regional, and even global scale. And forecasts also pointed at a future where the emissions of primarily sulfur oxides would exceed the total emissions from land-based activities if no measures were taken. Next, please. And since sulfur oxides in exhausts are directly related to the sulfur content of marine fuel, this led to a stepwise reduction in the maximum allowed sulfur content of the marine fuels. And here it's important to understand that these decisions on the stricter emission standards are taken within the International Maritime Organization, and the decisions are consensus-based, which most often implies the process is to be rather slow. As Sweden had severe problems with acid rain since the 1970s, Sweden was one of the countries that worked hard to get stricter regulations in place. And after some 20 years work, one would expect that we could now, since the new global sulfur limits entered into force in January last year, we could now expect that we should celebrate this success. But unfortunately, the celebration got a little bit of a bittersweet taste due to a somewhat unexpected development. When the strict regulations were designed, it was assumed from the start that ships would now switch to cleaner and much more expensive distilled fuels with a lower sulfur content. But in order to not hamper the development of alternative mitigation strategies, there is no specific demand on which fuel type that must be used by ships. But the ship owner is free to choose alternate fuels as long as he or she complies with the emission standard with respect to sulfur oxides to air. And this is, of course, good, not to hamper development of new environmental technologies, but unfortunately, until now, this has rather been the start of new environmental problems. And today, only a minor share of the ships use distilled fuels. And Ingela will tell you more about what they use instead. So thank you.
Thank you, Ida-Maja, and you'll get back later. So the focus today, like Ida-Maja said, is on accidental or operational oil spills and on scrubber water, and not the total profile of the contamination that comes out of ships. So there are three main options if you want to comply with the new sulfur regulations. You can either, as Ida-Maja said, use a highly distilled product with a low sulfur content, or you can still use the heavy fuel oil, but then you have to have a so-called scrubber, and we'll get back to what that is a bit later. But you can also use a new type of fuel that has come on the market, so what we here name hybrid fuels, and they are mixes of the heavy fuel oil and the more distilled fractions. They come in two versions. One that is really low in sulfur content, and that's for the so-called SECA areas, the sulfur emission control areas, and another one that can be used for all ships. Fuels that are based on petroleum, and so also hybrid fuels, they can be described by lots of chemical and physical properties. But here we just summarize some important aspects. The particular thing about these is that they can vary a lot between batches, even of the same brand, and they are also more non-compatible between different types or between different brands of the same type of product. They also have, like heavy fuel oil, higher pouring point, which means that you have to heat them before you can use them, and they also have a high viscosity. And this is due to a lot of the additives that are added, and in many cases that's paraffin or waxes. Another thing that is connected to petroleum-based fuels is the so-called water accommodated fraction, or WAF for short. The WAF appears when oil is mixed with water and substances from the oil gets dragged into the water. There's no standard method for how we experimentally make these types of WAFs, but there are proposed criteria. And they include that when you mix oil and water, you have a low headspace of air, low energy mixing, and you give it enough time to make sure that the water is saturated by the compounds from the oil. I said that they could vary, these fuels, and here is an example of parts of the components that are in oil, the polyaromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs. They are normally considered the most sort of toxic part. And as you can see, here's an example of 3 different hybrid fuels. 2 of them are of the same kind, but yet their PAH profile is really different. If you then look at the so-called WAFs that you get when you mix these oils with water, then you can see that the profiles differ yet again. And it wouldn't even be easy to try and predict which oil would have which profile. So they are really variable mixtures. We talked about the physical properties, and this video comes from an experiment that the Swedish Coast Guard did to test their present cleaning equipment for oil spills and how they would work for these new types of hybrid fuels. So they put 200 liters of oil into 20 cubic meters of water in a huge container. The water was slightly circulating, and here you can see how the equipment, how the equipment worked. Or perhaps should I say, did not work. The equipment that we use today, and they tried all sorts of models, couldn't take care of the oil from the water. And this is not the only time this has been recorded. It's been seen elsewhere, not least in the big accident outside Mauritius in 2020. So WAF is, of course, also made when you have an oil spill in the water or here in the container. And again, these substances leak out. And here we measured the PAHs in the water under this oil. And as you can see over the time, the concentrations increase and is then saturated after approximately 16 hours. Whether this is bad or not, to be able to judge that, you can do that by looking at some kind of environmental criteria. They don't exist for the sum of PAHs, they exist for some of the single ones. And here I'm just showing an example of one of the PAHs in the water that after 4 hours was over what's called the maximum acceptable concentration according to the Water Framework Directive. Now that I've talked about oil, I'm going to leave the floor to Christina to talk about the effects of low sulfur fuel on marine organisms.
Thank you. Right, and before I get into the details of this, I would just like to give a bit of background to the organism group which has been most studied when it comes to this type of fuels, and that's marine plankton. And so at the bottom of the food web, we have phytoplankton, which is more or less single-celled microalgae, some of them chain-forming, and they photosynthesize. But we also have zooplankton. And one of the smaller groups of zooplankton are microzooplankton. And the majority of them are ciliates, which are also single-celled, but slightly larger, and they feed on phytoplankton. And we also have a larger group of zooplankton called Mesozooplankton. And they can be anything from Copepods, a type of crustacean, to polychaetes or larvae of different animals like fish larvae or sea urchin larvae, starfish larvae, etc. And they feed both on microzooplankton and on phytoplankton. So this is a study from a Norwegian institute that compared the toxicity of a marine gas oil which is a distilled fuel, to a hybrid fuel. And they looked at the effects on this microalgae species called Skeletonema. And they found that the toxicity was very similar when comparing the two fuels. Here you can see that, or maybe I should turn on the pointer. The EC50 value for the marine gas oil was 56% of this water-accommodated fraction. And an EC50 is the concentration that gives 50% effect. And so for the hybrid fuel, this was pretty similar at 51%. They also looked at the toxicity towards this marine copepod. And there they actually found a difference in toxicity, where the marine gas oil had an EC50 of 26%, whereas the hybrid fuel had this effect at 41%. We also performed a study a few years ago where we looked at effects on copepod egg production in a community. And there we compared this other type of hybrid fuel, but at similar sulfur content called RMD80 to a marine gas oil. And there we saw that the lowest concentration that had an effect was 25% for the hybrid fuel, whereas the marine gas oil had no effect on copepod egg production. We also looked at effects on community diversity when exposed to only the hybrid fuel. And if you look at this graph here, you can see that each dot represents a community in one of the replicates, where the blue ones here in the middle are the controls, and the pink ones are those that have been exposed to hybrid fuel WAF. And we saw that there were changes in biodiversity already at 0.5% of this water-accommodated fraction. And this concentration is comparable to PAH content, both of this container study that Ingela presented after 4 hours, but also to what has been measured after oil spills or spills of diesel. So in both of these studies, we also looked at the toxic units of the fuels, and a toxic unit is the ratio of measured concentration to a concentration that we know gives effect. So a toxic unit of 1 is a concentration that we for sure know gives some kind of effect. And in this Norwegian study, they found that the marine gas oil had a higher toxic unit of 0.7, whereas the hybrid fuel had one of 0.4. In our study, we found an opposite pattern. So our marine gas oil had a toxic unit of 0.2, and the hybrid fuel one of 0.3. And this does kind of make sense given that we had opposite results in our studies. And this figure here is, well, it shows the individual toxic units for some of the measured individual compounds in our marine gas oil. And you can see that all of them, or most of them, have a similar contribution to the total toxicity of the fuel. And also that they are all basically aromatic hydrocarbons that are kind of volatile. And if we compare this to the hybrid fuel, we see that there are 2 compounds that stand out as major contributors to the toxicity, and these are PAHs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons. So to sum this up, first of all, the data on these type of fuels are very limited. We have our study and the Norwegian study. And there's definitely a need for more studies of this very common fuel type. We can kind of say that it's a bit inconclusive whether the marine gas oil or the hybrid fuel water-accommodated fractions are more toxic towards plankton, and it appears to depend very much on the composition of the fuel, like we saw in the marine gas oils. But at least what we know is that the effects of the marine gas oil, it starts at 26%, and the effects of the hybrid fuel starts at 0.5%, although we have to remember that there are very different endpoints that we're comparing here. And we also know that the toxicity of the marine gas oil appears to be driven by more volatile aromatic hydrocarbons, whereas the toxicity of the hybrid fuel is driven by PAHs. And finally, zooplankton appears to be more sensitive than phytoplankton.
Thank you, Ida-Maja. So the other solution to comply with the new sulfur regulation is the use of scrubber. And here you can see a so-called open loop scrubber. The exhaust from the engine comes in here, and is sprayed with seawater. And the seawater drags out, especially sulfur oxide, and takes it away, but it also drags out other substances. The exhaust comes out a bit cleaner, and the water is somewhat treated before it is discharged into the sea. The other system is the so-called closed loop system, where the water is reused. So same principle, exhaust gets in here, the exhaust gets sprayed with seawater, continues up here. The seawater falls down with all the different substances. There's some cleaning here, which is then bled off, further treated and into a holding tank, and some is discharged to the sea. This water can then be reused, but you have to add extra chemicals to increase the pH, otherwise the system doesn't work that well. But then it can be, to quite a large extent, reused in here. These figures that you see here, they show measured and estimated characteristics of scrubber water that enters the marine environment. And as you can see, the open loop discharges more per hour. This is calculated by a sort of standard ship, which might not be true for all ships then. They let out a larger volume, and the water is much more acidic. It's got a low pH compared to the closed loop, which discharge less and a slightly higher pH. But this is not the only thing that comes out. There are also other substances like metals, pHs, and nutrients, and they are all of concern for the marine environment. This next figure is a calculation and estimation using IMO guidelines, showing how much the different parts of shipping contribute to discharges of substances to the marine environment. On top are trace elements or metals, and in the bottom are PAHs here. These figures are for the Baltic Sea from 2018. I don't expect you to see this very closely. And then less than 2% of the ships were fitted with scrubbers. And only some of those ships had closed loop scrubbers, so most of them were actually open loop. And all the blue bars that you see here that stick out, they are the contribution from open loop scrubbers. And they by far exceed everything else that comes from shipping, although the vast majority of the ships didn't have scrubbers. And with that, it's your turn again, Christina, to talk about effects of scrubber water.
Yes, and again, we're going to start with open loop scrubbers and start with the effects on phytoplankton that has been observed. So in this study, they looked at how open loop water affected growth of this microalgae species called Rhodomonas. And in this graph, we can see cells per milliliter here on the y-axis, and then days on the x-axis. And what they saw was that these gray dots that represent 10% scrubber water gives an increased growth. And if we compare this to the control then, which is the black dots. And if we look at 100% scrubber water, there was no growth at all, the white ones here. And another study found similar results. At 10% of scrubber water, they found high levels of particulate organic phosphor, carbon, and nitrogen, and also an increased chlorophyll A content together with bacterial biomass and productivity at this level. There has also been some studies which have looked at effects on copepods. And in the study, they found an increased mortality starting at 10% of this open loop water. And they also found that the majority of the copepods were dead after 1 day at 30% of open loop water. In a different study, they found an increased mortality rate already at 1% open loop water, and that all copepods were dead after 8 days at 40%. In this study, they also looked at the development of copepods, and they have many life stages, and to reach each of the next ones, they have to molt until they can reach this adult stage at the end. And what they found was that there was a reduced molting at 5% scrubber water, and almost no copepods could develop at 10%. And before we move on to some of the effects that has been found from closed loop water, we just wanted to mention as well that there are some studies out there which has also looked on open loop water. And the reason why we haven't included their results is that they have used standardized methods where they have, for example, filtered the scrubber water to remove all the particles, some of which are very likely to be toxic. And furthermore, they have also adjusted pH. As Ingela shown, the open loop water is pretty acidic. And they've also adjusted salinity and dissolved oxygen. And of course, this is likely to influence the results. Finally, although they have concluded that they have found RQs, risk quotients, that are as high as 0.9 and 0.8%, and also that some compounds have been modeled to appear at levels that are half of their environmental quality standards, they have concluded that there is no risk from the use of these open loop scrubbers. So on to the effects of closed loops. So in this same study that I talked about before, they also found that there was an increased mortality rate from closed loop water, but this started now already at 0.04%. And all of the copepods were dead after 1 day when exposed to 5%. They also found reduced molting rate, again, at an even lower level at 0.1%, and almost none of the copepods could develop in the 0.5% treatment. Finally, they also found that there was some increased ingestion rates when exposed to the lower levels, 0.5 to 1%, but then no ingestion at all at 2%. So we have also recently performed some experiments on copepod communities using closed loop scrubber water. So we have performed 3 different experiments that you can see here in this graph, results from them, during 3 different seasons with different types of zooplankton communities. And we have looked at how closed loop water affects the Mesozooplankton, and then also how that indirectly affects the microzooplankton. So in this graph on the y-axis, you have concentration of the organism group, where the light blue ones are copepods, and the dark blue ones are ciliates. And you have the control here to the left, and then 2 levels of scrubber water to the right. And what we can see across all of these 3 experiments is that we have a lower survival in those communities that have been exposed to scrubber water. And as a result of that, we have an increased level of ciliates. And if we look into the diversity of these communities, we can see that the Mesozooplankton, here in blue or purple, are the ones that haven't been exposed. And then you can see in orange and yellow, the ones that have been exposed to scrubber water, that the community structure, the species structure is different. And as a result of this, we can also see indirect effects in diversity in the microzooplankton. Here in blue, the ones that have been incubated together with the control community, and then the yellow and orange, the ones that have been incubated together with the exposed communities. Finally, we also looked at ingestion rates in one of the experiments. And here you can see million cells ingested by the entire community per day. And then during the first day, the second day, and then the third day. And in yellow, we have the control. And as you can see, there is a lower ingestion rate in the ones that has been exposed to scrubber water. The same on the second day. And on the third day, we see an increased ingestion rate in the community that has been exposed to the 1.5% scrubber water. So there appears to be some kind of stress response, at least we suspect so. So to sum it up, the effects from the open loop water start at 1%, and zooplankton appears to be more sensitive, again, than phytoplankton. When it comes to the open loop, effects start already at 0.04%, so lower. And if we try to compare the two somehow, of course, we can tell that the closed loop is more toxic, but we have to remember that the discharge volumes are smaller. Thank you.
And now, Ida-Maja, back to you.
Thank you, Ingela, and thank you, Christina. Yes, to summarize a little bit then and point at some challenges with this use of scrubbers and hybrid fuels. As you now understand, both scrubbers and hybrid fuels are posing pressure on the marine environments. But there are, if we compare the challenges associated with the ecotoxicological risks that we have now discussed, there are some differences that we would like to point out. And if we start with the hybrid fuels, to the left, you can see the development over time from the 1990s until 2016. And we can see that the number of or volumes of oil spills observed, the reddish lines, are decreasing. So an increased work to get a safer shipping industry is walking hand in hand with environmental protection. And this decrease is despite that the number of flight hours have increased over time, the blue line. And also despite that the oil transportation or total oil volumes transported have also increased. But hybrid fuel spills are discrete events, and as we see it, maybe the major challenge is right now that there are no cleanup techniques in place. And also, as Ingela mentioned, the complex and varying mixtures of the fuels. So next, please. If we then compare with the scrubber water situation, instead of the discrete events, we rather have a continuous contamination. The map here to the right show the modeled scrubber water discharge all over the globe. And just like for the hybrid fuels, we still have the challenge related to the complex and varying mixture of the scrubber water chemical composition. Next, please. So needs that are identified. We do need to know more about the composition and variation, both of the hybrid fuels and the scrubber discharges. And this is great that there are ongoing projects working on this. For example, the organization PAIM, Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment, is currently running a large project on low sulfur fuel oil and characterization of hybrid fuels. And we also have the Horizon 2020 project Emerge, where scrubber discharge water are investigated further. There is also a need to better combine oceanographic models for fate, where the scrubber water and also hybrid fuel spills, where they end up, and combine that with data to assess the impact on the marine environment. And this is also intensively worked on within the Emerge project. Ingela, would you like to continue?
Yes, and to be able to actually do something sensible with these two first points that Ida-Maja mentioned, we do need more effect data. There are very few studies made on both scrubbers and especially on hybrid fuels. So we would need more data to be able to do both risk characterization of the fuels, but also the environmental impact assessment. And with this, we would just like to finish off with some recommendations. And the overall recommendation with respect to the aquatic marine environment has to be that we want to stimulate the use of low toxicity and carbon neutral fuels. This is nothing that is done overnight. So we also need to look at the two components like the oil. Here we feel there's a need to sharpen the criteria for fuel composition, just like one did for the sulfur, but also, of course, to develop new techniques for oil cleanup. When it comes to the scrubbers, we would like to see a phase out of the open loop scrubbers, but also that those who use closed loop, they can dispose of their waste under the so-called no special fee systems that harbours have. And with that, I just quickly want to show the references. They can be looked at YouTube in a few weeks' time or a month, and then say thank you for your attention. And I think the recording will stop now and we can take questions or whatever.